Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Site Comply webinar, which is all about the HPD, otherwise known as Housing, Preservation, and Development. My name is Kristen Harriton. I'm a Client Engagement Manager here at Site Comply, and I'm very excited to be here today to discuss one of New York City's most complicated agencies with you. So why a webinar on HPD? Well, we're very committed to providing ongoing education to all of our clients, clarifying all these complex rules and processes for New York City compliance. And HPD is one of the biggest juggernauts of them all. They have jurisdiction over all multiple dwelling residences in New York City in all 5 boroughs, and they maintain a massive operation regarding inspections and enforcement. And our goal today is to walk you through all the different components of HPD, from registration to the complaint and violation process, and then finally through the enforcement process. So we're going to start with the basics and then go from there. First, we're going to discuss HPD's annual property registration. And then we're going to talk about, again, complaints, inspections, and violations, that entire process from soup to nuts, letting you know what an inspector is looking for when they arrive on property. And then finally, we'll talk about certification, of course, violation resolution, which is very important. We'll mention heat and hot water a little bit because those violations can be trickiest of all. And then finally, talk a little bit about housing quality enforcement programs and what you can expect going forward from HPD in 2015. And along the way, of course, we'll pepper in a few best practices from your Site Comply account. And we'll make sure that you have all the tools you need going forward to answer any HPD questions that you may have. So just some housekeeping notes before we go ahead and get started. This webinar should only last about 40 minutes. I do want to make sure that we have time for any questions at the end. So I've gone ahead and muted the audio on this presentation to avoid any background noise. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in under the questions section of the GoToWebinar pop-up on your screen. And if I don't have a chance to get to your question during our time together today, I'll make sure to follow up with you directly after the webinar. And of course, our entire client services team is always available to answer any questions you may have about Site Comply or your compliance information at support@sitecomply.com. I'm going to definitely mention that email address a few more times today, but that is the magic contact email for our client services team. I also want to point out that HPD alerts are only a fraction of the compliance alerts you're seeing in your inbox, and we can always customize those alerts you're receiving to either minimize, make sure you're only getting what you need to see, or make sure that you have access to everything that we have to offer through your Site Comply account. So reach out to us at support, and we'll take care of that for you. We're also going to be recording today's webinar for your future reference, so feel free to ask us for a recording afterwards. We'll make sure that's available for you shortly after the webinar. And of course, we'll also be sending this entire deck to all of you, all our attendees, as well as all of our registrants. And we want to make sure that you guys have these resources available to you directly right after we're done. And now that that is all out of the way, let's go ahead and get the show on the road, get started with HPD registration. All right, so residential properties are required by law to register annually with HPD if they meet one of the following 2 criterion. They have to have either 3 or more residential units, or they have to have 1 or 2 residential units and neither the owner nor a family member of the owner occupies one of either of those units. So obviously, most of you fall into that first category, 3 or more residential units at one building. And in fact, a lot of you may fall into our second kind of grouping, which is hotels. Hotels are considered transient multifamily dwellings, and they are required to register annually with HPD. Now, typically, they may see less activity than your traditional residential building, but we have seen a lot of inquiries from HPD go out this year for hotel owners and managers to register. So certainly something to keep in mind if you do work at a hotel. And of course, again, I mentioned HPD requires you to register annually. They also require you to re-register if any of your information changes. So if the managing agent changes or if the owner certainly changes, you do have to re-register. And in fact, usually have a period of, I believe, 5 days within the actual change to re-register. And now the great news is re-registration does not have any associated fees. It is free, relatively speaking, that is, as opposed to regular annual registration, which carries a $13 fee. Now you won't have to pay this fee when you do register. This fee is automatically included on your property's statement of account. That's through your Department of Finance taxes. That usually goes through every July. So that registration fee will go through before your paperwork is due every year on September 1st. Those dates used to change depending on the size of the property, but now everything has been streamlined and is all due on that first day of September. And you can complete registration by visiting HPD's online property registration system, filling out the forms, and mailing that in. That's right. It's a little different than e-certification, which we'll talk about later, but if you'd like to register, you need to go to HPD's online registration system, print out the forms, and then send them in. You do not submit that online. So that's something that's really important to note as well. And once the paperwork is processed by HPD and the payments received, if all those taxes go through, the property will be considered validly registered until the next year, which again would be August 31st. I believe August has 31 days. It would be that last day of August when that property registration goes through. And I believe sometimes those dates even extend into September, sometimes September 15th. But again, registration is always due again for the next year on September 1st. So there's actually a really great resource for registration information in your Site Comply account. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly pull up my sample HPD account here. But you can see on the screen in my sample HPD account in our reporting tab, we actually do have a report available called the HPD registration report right here on the left-hand side, and all these pre-canned reports you can select to generate is our HPD registration report right down here. All you would need to do is click Run Report, but I've already done a sample for you. I'm going to go ahead and download that and show you what it looks like. This is a really helpful tool for checking in and seeing exactly what's due. And you'll see that we've got everything laid out as far as the properties go in Excel. You can always go ahead and sort that information. We also do have the report in a PDF version as well, so you can go ahead and check either one that you like. The PDF one is really great, and it's a nice one, again, to generate every year annually. Now, something to mention about all our reports on Site Comply is you can set them to be automatically recurring. So it's a best practice of a lot of our clients to have a recurring registration report set for every July so they can go ahead and see which properties they need to change any information for and what they're already validly registered for. You can also set one for October or November to make sure that all your registrations went through and that everything is valid, because we are constantly updating this information from HPD. So again, definitely something you want to pay attention to. All right, and that is our first Site Comply best practice. We'll go ahead and jump back into our HPD information. And as I mentioned before, we had some hotels, we saw some hotels across the city that were getting what's known as a Class I violation this year. And a Class I violation is a little different. It's certainly not issued as frequently as Class A, B, or C violations, but it is also known as an order to do something. And in this case, it is an order to register. So if you see a Class I violation, know that action is required on your part, not necessarily to correct an infraction, but to actually do something like, in this case, register your property annually. And if you fail to register a property, there are a few things that unfortunately you cannot do. You cannot certify violations, you cannot request a violation dismissal, you cannot recover possession of the premises or non-payment of rent claims against any tenants, and you may also be subject to civil penalties. So again, although registration seems pretty straightforward. It's certainly something that you definitely want to pay attention to, so everything runs smoothly year in and year out. If you do see one of those Class 1 designations, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're always happy to walk you through it and explain exactly what that means as well. And one of the reasons that HPD requires each property to register is to facilitate the proper service and organization of complaints and violations. Let's take a step back and quickly review the most basic parts of this process. HPD collects inbound complaints from 311, and as you all probably know, anyone can call 311 anonymously and trigger a complaint. That is anyone. A tenant, the person on the corner, a stranger, one of the people that hangs out in Times Square. Literally anyone can call 311. So it's always important to note when you receive a complaint and what's it for. Now, typically with HPD, complaints are based on quality of life issues. That is lead paint, rodents and pests, heat and hot water, among other things. And of course, heat and hot water is the big issue now in heat and hot water season. We'll talk about that a little more later. As soon as Site Comply alerts you of a complaint, we suggest that your team examine the perceived issue and verify exactly whether or not it requires correction before an inspector arrives. Alerts are critical to staying on top of complaints. Of course, we'll always have those complaints ready for you to view in your Site Comply account or in a report, but that alert is the timely notification that you need to investigate the issue and make sure that either there's no infraction present and everything is okay, or that you have the time you need to make necessary repairs. And of course, if you can, intercept an inspector that's going to prevent any issued violations, which is the goal here in responding to complaints. Now, if an inspector does show up on property and when they do arrive on site, they're not just looking for whatever the complaint was called in. They're looking for many other factors, 6 of which we'd issue here. These are kind of the most common things that an HPD inspector looks for when they're arriving at a particular building or unit. They're going to look for operational smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, illegal gates or bars on the windows. They're going to look for illegal double cylinder locks, and those are the ones that lock from the inside that it requires a key to leave the unit. Those are not legal. They're also going to look for window guards in any units with a child under the age of 11, and then any signs of lead paint in a unit with a child under the age of 6. These are things that inspectors are trained to look for, and again, they will go above and beyond to search for these things while they arrive on property investigating the initial complaint. So it's very important to make sure that you're aware of these factors as well and that everything here is taken care of, because you wouldn't want violations for any of these items either. The more violations you can prevent, the better. And once an HPD inspector has the opportunity to access the apartment, they'll post a disposition of the complaint. And of course, this can go one of 2 ways. The complaint is going to verify whether or not violations were warranted or issued. And if the answer is no, then the complaint is closed and no further action is required, which is always nice. Of course, if the answer is yes, if the inspector does verify that the conditions complained of exist, he or she will issue violations and close the initial complaint out. So the complaint is always closed after the inspection, but it really determines whether or not violations will be open or not issued. And now I talked about Class I violations before. You can see them at the bottom of this chart. They are orders to correct, especially for failure to register. You can also see there are other types of Class I violations. They are notices listing involvement in HPD programs that we'll discuss a little later. But the 3 classes at the top are the ones that I really want to focus on now. That's Class C, B, and A. Immediately hazardous, hazardous, and non-hazardous. And as you can see in this chart, they each have different time frames for correcting that type of violation. So the more hazardous a violation, the more immediately it needs to be cleared. And there are certain violations that have extended periods of time, such as lead violations and window guard violations, because that lead especially does take time to fix and go through the process of environmentally securing the proper vendors to remediate said lead. But you'll see Class B and A violations. So are typically the more common ones in which supers can perform a repair, and then you can go ahead and self-certify. Now, speaking of certifying, how do you exactly clear these violations? That's the important thing, right? Well, we talked about certifying a little bit before. The great thing with HPD violations is you can self-certify them, meaning that you can say that you performed the work yourself or your related agent performed the work, and you're verifying that that work was completed. And there are a few ways you can do this. The first is via paper certification. You can use what's known as a blue sheet or a Civ 194. You can fill that out and mail it into the proper HPD borough office. Or you can e-certify, which is in most cases a better process because you're able to see immediately whether or not your e-certification was received instead of sending it out into the mail and wishing it luck. But when it's working smoothly, HPD's e-certification is really a great tool to use when you want to quickly self-certify and clear these violations. All you have to do is enroll by creating a user ID, selecting your building and violations. And of course, if you are enrolling a building in e-certification for the first time, you may need to provide ownership information, and only owners, officers, or managing agents are eligible to enroll for this process. So that's something important to note as well. Once you're logged in and you find the violations you'd like to correct, all you do is you submit the new violation status, complete the attached certification, and then you want to print or save a copy for your records. And of course, Site Comply will send you an alert closing the loop once HPD goes ahead and finally clears out those violations. But we recommend, when it can be done, to just self-certify by that self-certification due date. It really is the very best way to go ahead and make sure that all your violations are cleared. You can also see here we put together a chart of some of our most common certification statuses. So obviously closed is the status that we all want to get to where there's no further action required. There are also other statuses like NOV Cert, where the certification was received, but the condition hasn't yet been re-inspected. Sometimes these violations are audited by an inspector. They will come out and verify the self-certification. They will also say NOV Late if the certification was performed after the self-certification due date. So then you have to go through other avenues to correct, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. And you'll see there are a few other statuses such as certificate invalid, which usually has to do with the paperwork, signatures being off, dates, things like that. A Civ 14 mailed. For those of you that aren't aware, a Civ 14 is a notice that HPD sends to the tenant to verify that the conditions have been corrected. They essentially ask the tenant to sign off on the repair work. The tenant must repair that notice. They will also list to be re-inspected if they would like to verify the status themselves, or of course, no access. And the important thing to point out about no access is if they re-inspected the condition or they attempted to re-inspect the condition, HPD has 70 days to attempt that re-inspection. If they have not inspected that unit or the building after 70 days, the correction is accepted, deemed certified, and then the status is changed to close. So I just wanted to point out where all this information is in your Site Comply account as well, because I know it's a lot of information in general, and I want to make sure that you're exactly aware of where to find this. So going back into my sample HPD webinar account, you're going to see that we have all of our light blue tabs up at the front, and I'm going to go right here into our violations tab, scrolling down under DOB violations, DOB ECB violations, and then finally our HPD violations. And you're going to see here that we're bringing all of the key detail right to the front. Not only are we going to tell you the issue date, the property, and of course the self-certification due date, we're also going to give you that key description as well as the order code. So this is really important because for certain types of violations like lead-based violations, that order number, that 3-digit string right there, really depends on what type of certification documents you need to send in. So when you ever see a lead type violation with a specific order number, feel free to reach out to us at Site Compliant. We'd be happy to walk you through exactly what needs to be done for that particular code. But again, all the information you need to self-certify and correct that violation is right here. And of course, that due date, that key highlighted date right there. In addition to having all the information here under HPD violations, we're of course going to show you those due dates here in your dashboard. We'll let you know when those HPD owner certification due dates are coming due. And my favorite thing actually is to click this link right here that says view calendar and look at my dates that way. So I can see exactly laid out when my HPD self-certification due dates are coming in ahead of time. And better yet, I can go ahead and click this link and actually sync this calendar to Outlook, Google, or Apple iCal and make sure that I get all those dates automatically and immediately going forward for my properties. So a really great tool right there. If you haven't logged in yet and synced your calendar, I highly suggest that you do. All right, now that we've gone over yet another one of our best practices, I'm going to go ahead and switch back into our slides. And now we'll talk about what happens if you're not able to self-certify. So again, the most direct and easiest way to clear these violations is to submit self-certification, whether by mail or electronically, before that due date. Now, if you can't, because let's face it, sometimes it's just impossible to get the work done in that period of time, there are solutions, although they are more expensive than self-certification, which doesn't have a fee as of yet, and they are more time consuming. So the first, what we're going to talk about is HPD dismissal request, and this is the one most commonly used. You can contact HPD and request that an inspector come out to your property and dismiss any outstanding violations. And by any outstanding violations, I mean any violations within a particular unit or within the entirety of a building. It's really up to you of what you want that HPD inspector to look at. And you'll see here there is a chart outlining the fee. It depends, it used to depend on the size of the building, but now it actually depends on the amount of open violations. And you'll see here, this is what it would cost to perform a dismissal request for that many violations. Now, something very important that I want you to know about dismissal requests is that you are inviting an HPD inspector on your property. While they may dismiss a number of open violations, and of course that's great for your property, they may also issue more violations. And we've seen this happen a lot of times. We've seen a large number of violations drop off, and then unfortunately some trickle on as well, because you always want to make sure, even if you close out the open issues violation-wise, that there's nothing else that could represent an infraction, because the HPD inspector will still be looking for those 6 key factors, and they will still be looking for anything that's misplaced or out of the ordinary, not only in the particular unit that you're requesting, but again, at the entirety of the property. So do call HPD and file a dismissal request at your own risk, shall I say, although the risk may be small, it is something that you will want to consider when you do invite an inspector to visit your property on site. And now the second way to clear open violations is known as a violation reissuance. Now this can only happen once ever per property. This is a one-time thing. And the way a violation reissuance works is that your property must be registered, and all outstanding violations that are open must be over 12 months old. That's right. Any open violations cannot have been issued within the past year. So if you have open violations from early 2014 and 2013, that's fine. But if anything was issued less than a year ago, then you cannot request a violation reissuance. If you do fall within those guidelines, you can submit a violation reissuance form. And what HPD will do is they will send you all new notices of violations with all new certification due dates. Basically, they're reissuing you violations from scratch. They're giving you new due dates so you can go back and either e-certify them or certify them by mail. After that, after you've certified all the open violations, HPD will go ahead and re-inspect all the conditions. Or, of course, again, if no inspector appears within 70 days of the certification date, then all the violations will be deemed complied. So again, this is a great process if you have, say, an older violation that's maybe a few years old, or, again, we've seen sometimes from the 70s or 80s, and you just want to clear it, but you don't have to go through a dismissal request process or paying the fees or having an inspector out to your property yet. You really just want to clear that old outstanding violation. You can go ahead and request a one-time reissuance for that particular building. So a great option in situations like that, and something you can certainly be aware of. Now, before we move on to enforcement, I mentioned before, I really wanted to briefly discuss two specific types of violations: heat and hot water. And as most of you know, we are in the throes of heat season, which begins each year on October 1st and concludes on May 31st. So a majority of the year is heat season. And from October 1st, 2014 through today, February 26th, over 141,000 heat and hot water complaints were registered. I'll say it again. In the past 5 months, almost 150,000 complaints about heat and hot water were registered across the city. Over 57,000 inspections were attempted from these complaints, and over 5,000 violations have been issued. And those huge numbers are no fluke. We are seeing a spike in heat-related complaints. It's more prevalent year after year after year. And in order to stay compliant during heat seasons, owners have to follow the temperature regulations outlined right here in this chart. If a heat or hot water violation is issued, it must be corrected within 24 hours of the posting of the notice at the property. This can often be difficult, especially because those notices disappear. Again, Site Comply will always send you an alert letting you know when HPD has issued any heat or hot water violations, giving you the notice needed to make those corrections. And although all complaints are especially important to monitor, minimizing heat and hot water complaints are critical, absolutely critical to maintaining a violation-free or low violation building. Beginning in June 2012, HPD actually began enforcing penalties alongside heat and hot water violations. So you can see they begin charging, basically saying that owners can satisfy heat and hot water violations by paying $250 and correcting if it is their first go around. Or if HPD commences litigation on a particular building, they can charge that building for any heat and hot water violations that have not yet been corrected per day. And those are huge amounts, $250 to $500 per day for an initial heat or hot water violation, and $500 to $1,000 per day for any subsequent violations at the same building during the same or the next calendar year. So again, preventing those violations, making sure they're corrected on time is key. You would not want a litigation brought up by HPD to commence, because then those fines can just snowball and get really out of control. So heat and hot water, the two key things to remember between every October and each May. But luckily I do hear, hopefully it's getting warmer outside and we will almost be out of heat and hot water season yet. So the countdown has begun. So what happens exactly if violations go uncorrected, period? If we don't use any of those resolutions to either self-correct them or have HPD clear that slate clean? These are just a few programs and ways that HPD uses to basically enforce all of their regulations and penalize any open violations. We talked about HPD litigation a little bit. They can bring cases up against landlords, as well as tenants can bring cases up against landlords. There are a few other programs that you see here. The emergency repair program actually is one of the big ones that many of you may be familiar with. It is when Class C violations go uncorrected, HPD may issue an open market order for an HPD approved contractor to perform the repair work. Now, of course, the key there is HPD approved, which means they may be more expensive, more likely, than a superintendent or another vendor performing work for you. So if you are notified that an emergency repair program exists for one of your Class C violations, it's always helpful to make sure the repair work is done before that contractor arrives on property. And that way, you'll save money in the fees that the contractor would have spent, and you'll just have to pay a nominal show-up fee instead of that full repair charge. You must also note that if there are any pending charges related to ERPs, you will not be able to certify any violations, file for a dismissal request, or file a violation reissuance. All those charges have to be clear, and of course, just like registration, those go through taxes as well. So you'll see those in your Department of Finance statements also. Now, something else you'll see in your site compliant account that's an enforcement program is that HPD litigation program. And as I mentioned before, these cases can be initiated by HPD directly or by tenants to seek penalties, or of course to seek action or inaction on particular violations or items. Specific information about individual HPD cases is actually not publicly available. And of course, this is due to the nature of the housing courts because it is private court-protected information, so it's not something that anyone publicly has access to. But what we do have access to is the Housing Litigation Division hotline, which you can see the number here, 212-863-8200. Again, don't worry, we'll go ahead and send you these slides. We'll make sure you have that number, but it is the number to call if you ever have any questions about housing litigation, because again, you cannot find that information anywhere online. These are also some programs, the 7A program, which is a management service program for abandoned buildings, as well as the Proactive Preservation Initiative, which is more to mentor buildings, ensure they are maintained in safe condition. Those are some of the minor programs that HPD offers. Again, we'll send you this information so you have it, but the two I really want to focus in on, the first one here is the Underlying Conditions Program. This is relatively new. It was classified under Local Law 6 of 2013, and it focuses on buildings with recurring mold and water leak violations resulting from any impaired building or infrastructure problems. So there are 50 buildings that are included in this program annually. If a building is included in the program, HPD issues an order, those are those Class I violations, requiring correction on those violations within 4 months. And of course, there may be potential penalties if those violations go uncorrected outside of that 4-month period. But again, those are only limited to 50 buildings based under Local Law 2016. The larger, more prevalent program is this next tab right here, is the Alternative Enforcement Program. Every year, HPD designates 200, and actually, as of 2015, it will now be 250 severely distressed multiple dwellings each year around January 31st. Class I violations just went out for the AEP a few short weeks ago. And when you are included in the AEP, it is really dependent on your open number of B and C violations at a particular individual property, as well as any outstanding ERP charges what that total is. Owners are notified via January, and tenants are also notified via a public posting at the building by HPD at each of their units. If a building is included in the AEP program, there is something that the owner and manager can do to rectify that inclusion. They have 4 months, just like the Underlying Conditions Program, to correct any qualifying conditions. Failure to correct those conditions may result in additional emergency repairs, liens, and significant fees from HPD. But you do have 4 months to either perform dismissal requests or again perform violation reissuances and make sure that all of those violations are cleared, removing you from this program of 250 buildings. Again, out of the city, 250 buildings is a very, very, very small number considering the amount of buildings that are in all 5 boroughs, but this is certainly something you want to pay attention to and of course make sure that HPD does have ways of enforcing these things. We've seen that number 200 go up, and I'm almost certain that it will go up in the future. But of course, if it does, we'll let you know about it firsthand. So one of the most important things that I wanted to bring up is what to expect in 2015. I know it's kind of difficult to predict what the agencies will do. The only thing we know for sure is that they will change things because they have every year. Something big that is actually coming tomorrow that we wanted to make sure you all knew about is the Housing Information Guide Enforcement Regulation. Now, this notice that we'll send to you along with this slide deck is the Housing Information Guide must be posted in a conspicuous place at your property within the view of the mail area. So it is just a notice saying that housing information guides are available in multiple languages online for your tenants to view. And again, it must be placed near the mailbox. This law goes into effect tomorrow, February 27th. So we wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of this change. Again, we'll make sure to send this out for those of us who weren't able to attend today's webinar, but certainly something that you want to be aware of, especially since it goes into effect tomorrow and inspectors will be looking for this. We've been told from HPD commissioners that inspectors will be checking for these housing guide notices when they arrive on property. And of course, this violation would be categorized as a non-hazardous, but still not something that you certainly want to deal with. So just make sure that you take that notice that we'll send you and post it somewhere near your mailboxes. There are also news about penalties for repeat violations coming down from HPD. We recently attended a meeting with HPD and they let us know that there is a small possibility that they may be charging fines for repeat B and C violations that are uncorrected after 2 inspections. So anything that remains open after 2 inspections may have additional associated penalties. Now, this has not gone into effect yet. This is still under review because there are a lot of questions here. We're not exactly sure what this means, how HPD would enforce this, how they would track any of the open violations, or what those penalties would be. So this is something that we just want to be aware of going forward in 2015. And again, with any other changes that occur here, we will make sure you know about it as soon as we get word. If this is a regulation, they will be going into place. But for now, please know that if you have open B and C violations, it would be worth it to go ahead and attempt either a dismissal request or a violation reissuance just to go ahead and get them cleared so you don't have to face any penalties down the line if they do decide to implement those. All right, and to finally wrap this up, I just wanted to go over some of the best practices that we talked about before within Site Comply. Again, responding immediately to those alerts that you get in your inbox. If you have any complaints, you can go ahead and verify those conditions to prevent violations. However, some violations are just unpreventable. If a violation is issued, be aware of that due date so you can self-certify and streamline the process in the easiest, to say the least, for HPD and the quickest way. Within Site Comply, you can also set up automatically recurring reports for both property registration and open violations. And of course, you can sync your Site Comply calendar to stay aware of any HPD self-certification due dates. That separate compliance calendar will make sure that you have all the necessary due dates to rectify these violations in your day-to-day tablet. And I'm going to go ahead and check to see if we have any HPD questions. And it looks like we are all set to go. But again, if you do have any questions, if you have follow-up from this webinar, do not hesitate to reach out to us at support@sitecomply.com. You can also respond directly to any alert, and that goes to our entire team. So we are more than happy to help you at any time. You can call our main line as well, or visit us directly through your Site Comply account via the Help Center where you signed up today, or any other contact me links that you'll find within an alert and within Site Comply. And I mentioned many times, I just want to make clear that everyone who registered today will receive a copy of today's presentation. And again, we will make this recording available for you and your colleagues should you want to go ahead and forward it on to any of your other team members. But other than that, that is a wrap on our latest compliance education webinar. Be sure to check your email for any future webinar events. We'll make sure to keep them coming in 2015. And feel free to send us feedback on what you'd like to see going forward. We want to know what you're interested in learning about so we can provide that information for you. So do not hesitate to get in touch with us. I'm especially interested in learning what you'd like to learn about so that can better help us as we plan our year's education program. Again, my name is Kristen Harrington, representing your very friendly, if I do say so myself, client services team here at Site Comply. I certainly hope to see you again for our next webinar offering, and I hope y'all have a good, great week. Stay warm, and we will see you next time. Have a great day.